Okay, so Patrick Mahomes is pretty damn good at the whole football thing. Ever since he was drafted back in 2017 and spent a year developing behind Alex Smith, the man has had the AFC and seemingly the entire NFL in a chokehold. So honestly, I really hate to do this, but with yet another Super Bowl title to his name, we have to ask the question: how does his career stack up to the other legends that he's been chasing? And just through 5 years of their career alone, who is the best quarterback to ever play? And after crunching just way too many numbers, look, I'm not clickbaiting you. These results are genuinely shocking. Alright, so step one is the sample size, right? So I thought the bigger the better, and grabbed a colossal sample of exactly 25 of the greatest quarterbacks of all time since 1960. So just think of random ass all-time great quarterbacks, and chances are they're probably here. Now for step two, the most important step, we have to establish the statistics, and although it's pretty subjective admittedly, I think these 6 different categories will give us about as good of an idea of who the best quarterback is through the first 5 years as possible. So let's gather up all the contestants and see, after looking at all the different categories, which quarterback will stand on top of the corpses of their competitors and grave their name in football immortality. So the first category we're going to be looking at is passer rating plus completion percentage. And since stats like QBR only go back to 2008, I had to improvise a little bit and basically make a whole new efficiency stat. So basically what this stat is going to show us is which quarterbacks are the most efficient through their first 5 years on average, and the first place person is going to get 10 points, and the 10th place person is going to get 1 point, and everyone else below that gets nothing. And here's the graph, with Patrick Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers basically dwarfing the entire competition. And you know, coincidentally, with both of them being above all of the rest, it appears that maybe benching a quarterback behind a veteran presence seems to help a quarterback a lot more than maybe people would have thought in the past. Or maybe they're both just, you know, good at football. That could be it too. Regardless, by looking at the graph, you can also see more old school guys like Johnny Unitas, Fran Tarkenton, and Terry Bradshaw being near the bottom of the list, primarily because of differing play styles during that era. And obviously near the top of the list, you got Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, and Phillip Rivers, all guys who played their entire careers in the modern era. Now the next category to look at is the number of MVP votes that each quarterback got. So by going through each and every MVP in NFL history, I tracked which of these quarterbacks got the most first place votes. And although Patrick Mahomes has won 2 MVPs to this point, he finds himself in 3rd, behind Brett Favre and Steve Young winning by an overwhelming amount. Turns out Steve Young has a massive advantage because he was never a consistent starter until his later years with the 49ers, where he was at the peak of his game and won multiple MVP awards. Then you got Brett Favre at 2, where he ended up not playing in his first season in Atlanta, found himself in Green Bay, and near the end of this 5-year stretch caught fire and made 2 All-Pro teams in a row where he got the majority of his MVP votes. And you know, oddly enough, we got a complete flip-flop from the last graph, as we now see older guys like Johnny Unitas, Dan Fouts, and Ken Stabler crack the top 10. And near the bottom of the list, you got Russell Wilson, who is at this point just famous for never coming even close to winning an MVP, and then you got the Steelers' pair of quarterbacks, Ben Roethlisberger and Terry Bradshaw, who both took a really long time to develop fully. Next up, we got average winning percentage, which takes into account how much the team won as well as how much that player won when they were on the team. So this stat basically takes into account the strength of the team almost more than the player individually. And here we see Ken Stabler shoots up the list to number 1, overtaking Mahomes. But Patrick Mahomes is right there, winning 79.75% of his games through just 5 years. And in the top 10, we got some new faces who haven't been here before, with Tom Brady finally showing up, and Donovan McNabb, a surprising player who I wasn't even considering adding to this pool. And man, I feel bad. There's some sharp contrasts here, as you got Ken Stabler winning 80% of his games, meanwhile poor Fran Tarkenton's over here winning 35% of them. Also for me, seeing Joe Montana at 10 was a little bit surprising, as it never really occurred to me that it took him a minute for those 49ers teams to really gel and get going into the well-oiled machine that we now know them to be today. Now for this 4th category, I thought about throwing a little bit of a curveball and doing average interception percentage, where the lower the percentage, the better. And by looking at the graph, Of course, Mahomes is first again. And the most polarizing player on this list is going to be Ken Stabler, who is just at number 1 in terms of winning percentage, but drops all the way down to 25th in terms of interception percentage. For the first time so far, Dan Marino finally finds himself outside the top 10, and Aaron Rodgers and Mahomes just continue to pull away, showing that they were just a different breed. Also, just a weird thing that I found while making these graphs is that Tom Brady and Joe Montana just randomly find themselves pretty much right next to each other in just about all of them. Let's see if you pick up on that as well. Anyway, guys like Russell Wilson and Donovan McNabb proved to be that they were probably just underrated guys who had great teams around them and were conservative with the ball. So that's gotta be worth something at least. Anyway, Russell Wilson and Donovan McNabb proved to be recurring characters, and Drew Brees finally cracks the top 10. Now, next I got total passing yards, and I decided to do this without passing touchdowns, basically because it, to me, measures how great a quarterback is better than touchdowns. Yes, I know, this is still a skewed stat that favors the more modern quarterback than the one of past eras, but still, it shows who's just on a different level compared to the rest. As by looking at this graph, there aren't too many things that stand out other than Dan Marino being at number 5, with the top 10 being almost all quarterbacks who played in the 2000s and 2010s. It just shows that throughout this list, Dan Marino in the 1980s was the outlier of all outliers, and during his first 5 years of play, he does not get anywhere near the credit that he deserves. But Russell Wilson falls into the latter part of the top 10, and Peyton Manning shoots up from the bottom 20, where he's consistently been, into the top 3. And Ken Stabler kind of just lives at 25 now, I guess. And finally, the sixth graph that will help us to determine how great these quarterbacks were during their first 5 years is the total Pro Bowl selections. So here's the graph, and I also factored in all pros to give tiebreakers and to just give more context to how great those players were. And like I just said, there he is, Dan Marino topping the list, making 5 Pro Bowls in 5 years and an All-Pro in 3 of those seasons. So Dan Marino, Patrick Mahomes, and Johnny Unitas accomplished the impossible, making 5 Pro Bowls in their first 5 seasons of starting. And by looking at the top 10 further, you see a guy like Steve Young at number 9 who has only 3 Pro Bowl selections but 3 All-Pros in those 3 seasons. And you know, Aaron Rodgers falls out of the top 10 while Mahomes remains steady, and it's time to finally crunch the final numbers. By awarding 10 points to the guy who ranked in at number 1 and 1 point to the guy who ranked in at number 10, this is the final results of all 25 of the greatest players of all time, and how great were they during their first 5 years of starting. So I guess let's start at the bottom of this top 10 list, where we see Brett Favre, a guy who I predicted would be a lot higher, but it turns out he kind of just got a majority of his points during the MVP round and kind of just coasted from there. And at number 9, we see Kurt Warner, a guy who was just a flamethrower coming out of the gate, but just fizzled out over time. Then we see Steve Young and Phillip Rivers at 8 and 7, guys who weren't exactly starting immediately early on, but once they got their shot, they proved that they were going to be here to stay. So then, here we are in the top 6, and Ken Stabler actually almost cracked the top 5. If you remember correctly, the man was actually last place in a singular category, so the fact that he's even in the top 10 is a miracle in my eyes. Crazy. But anyway, then we see Donovan McNabb and Russell Wilson, in my eyes creating this little trifecta of players who kind of just benefited from having great teams around them. Then we have the top 3, where the 2 quarterbacks, Aaron Rodgers and Dan Marino, are just in another universe compared to the other quarterbacks in this top 10. And they're pretty different too. Rodgers, as you remember, was a guy who sat behind Brett Favre for a few years, and Dan Marino was just thrown straight into the flames, but both came out just as sculpted. And I'll say it again, but even more impressive, Dan Marino did all of this in the 1980s with a significantly worse team than anyone even close to him. And you know what? Just to prove that Dan Marino didn't have as much help, I decided to calculate every single team's combined SRS score through 5 years so we can really get a good look at who had the best teams and who had the worst. And whoa, big shocker, Russell Wilson and Ken Stabler are on top of the entire list, and Dan Marino himself is at 14 with a noticeably low SRS score than Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes in the top 3. But let's not ignore the elephant in the room for much longer, because Patrick Mahomes just broke this entire graph. 56 points. That is not okay. I mean, even if you had told me before I started this list that Mahomes would blow everyone out of the water, my jaw would still be on the floor looking at this graph. So, there you have it. What we've been watching, everything that we've seen from Patrick Mahomes in the last 5 years is nothing short of all-time greatness. Although he's been able to take advantage of the luxuries of the passing era that we're in now, Patrick Mahomes has just defied every single expectation that a quarterback has ever had on themselves. So this isn't recency bias. Through his first 5 years, Patrick Mahomes is on a career trajectory that we've never, ever seen before. Anyways, if you like this video, then subscribe, because I got a lot of videos on the channel just like this one. If you like this video, then watch this video right here where I found who won the hardest Super Bowl in NFL history. It's pretty good, trust me. Anyways, until next time.